Some changed it to say, Joseph and I have been looking all over for you. Or to say, we have been looking all over for you, thereby circumventing the problem of calling Joseph the father of Jesus. I'll give you one other example of what strikes me as probably an intentional change. It's a very interesting passage in the Gospel of Matthew. It's a passage in which Jesus is talking about the end of time, when the end will come. This continues to be a source of fascination in my part of the world. When I moved to Chapel Hill in 1988, there was a big furor because there was a book that had been written that was in 2 million copies of this book were in circulation. Some of you may remember this. I don't think it hit this part of the world quite as badly. This book was called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. Now, for those of you who are strong Episcopalians, let me explain the rapture. So the rapture is when Jesus comes back from heaven and takes everybody who is a follower out of this world, and then the 7-year tribulation hits and the Antichrist arises. And so that's what, all the stuff in the Left Behind series. Well, before the Left Behind series, there was this book, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. And this guy literally was a NASA scientist who wrote literally. This guy named Edgar Whisenant, who had been a NASA scientist and then became a biblical scholar, who had 88 reasons why the rapture is going to occur in 1988. Let me give you one of them because it relates to the passage I'm talking about. In this passage, in Matthew 25, Jesus tells his followers, they want to know when's the end of all time going to happen. And Jesus tells them, learn the lesson from the fig tree. When the fig tree puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So too, when all these things take place, you'll know that the Son of Man is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. Okay? So this Edgar Whisenant wanted to use this passage to figure out, well, when is it going to take place? Jesus has given us the clue. When the fig tree puts forth its leaves. What is the fig tree in Scripture? Often in the Hebrew Bible, the fig tree is a symbol for the nation of Israel. What does it mean for the fig tree to put forth its leaves? It means after it's been dead through the winter, it comes back to life. When does Israel come back to life? When it again becomes a sovereign state in 1948. This generation will not pass away before all these things take place. How long is a generation in the Bible? 40 years. 1948 plus 40, bingo, 1988. There were 87 other proofs, which I won't give you. This was taken very seriously in my part of the country. I had students whose parents literally sold the farm, thinking that it was coming. Now, somebody pointed out to Whisenant, the guy who wrote this thing, pointed out that Jesus also said, no one knows the day or the hour when it'll come. He had predicted it was going to come during the Rosh Hashanah festival in October. And they said, but Jesus said, no one knows the day or the hour. And Whisenant replied, well, I don't know the day or the hour. I just know the week. So in this passage, which has been abused and misused over the years, there is this interesting verse where the disciples want to know when it's going to come, and Jesus then tells them, no one knows, he says. As to that day or hour, no one knows, not the angels in heaven, nor even the Son, but the Father alone. Scribes came to that and were confused by it. The Son of God doesn't know? How could the Son of God not know when the end is going to come? Surely the Son of God is all-knowing, omniscient. And so when scribes got to this place, they dealt with the problem simply by eliminating the words. So that in later medieval manuscripts, Jesus doesn't say, not even the Son. So you get rid of the problem simply by excising the words from the text. That's what I would call an intentional change. It looks like somebody changed the text intentionally. Well, these are all rather smallish kinds of problems, but I want to point out that there are, in fact, some big problems in the text of the New Testament, ones that actually affect passages that are near and dear to many people's hearts. So let me give you a few examples before wrapping this up of some big differences that matter. Probably the most popular story from the Gospels today is the story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. The reason I think this is the most popular story is because it's in every Hollywood movie about Jesus. Even Mel Gibson, who was talking about the last hours of Jesus, had to include this, and so he had a flashback where this story occurs of the woman taken in adultery. So you know the story. The Jewish leaders have caught this woman in the act of adultery. They lead her to Jesus, and they set a trap for him. They say, now according to the law of Moses, she's to be stoned to death. What do you say? This is a trap for Jesus, because if he says, well, yeah, stone her, then he's violating his teachings of love and forgiveness and mercy. But if he says, no, forgive her, then he's breaking the law of Moses. So what's he supposed to do? Well, he stoops down and starts writing on the ground, and he looks up and he says, let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her. He stoops back down, writes on the ground a little bit more, and one by one, the authorities start leaving the scene until Jesus looks up again and there's no one left except for the woman. He stands up and says, woman, is there no one left to condemn you? She says, no, Lord, no one. He replies, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. So this is a beautiful story filled with pathos, very interesting. There are all sorts of interesting questions that the story raises, one of which is, if she was caught in the act of adultery, where's the man? They're both supposed to be stoned to death, right? But they apparently let him go. This story, as it turns out, as interesting, intriguing, and moving as it is, was not originally in the Gospel of John. In fact, it wasn't originally in any of our Gospels. This passage was not originally in the New Testament. How do I know that? The oldest manuscripts of the Gospel of John don't have this story. The Greek commentators on the Gospel of John, the church fathers who wrote Greek commentaries on the Gospel of John, don't mention this story for 1,000 years. Somebody heard this story, or made it up. Heard it or made it up, and wrote it in the margin of a manuscript, probably. Somebody else took this manuscript and saw this story in the margin and thought it belonged in the text and put it in the text. Somebody else copied that manuscript, and that manuscript got copied a lot until down through the Middle Ages, the story became quite popular until it was these later manuscripts were used by the translators of the King James Bible, and that's how it came into English. So even though it wasn't originally in the New Testament, it's a later story that was added to the New Testament. Give you a second example. These first couple examples I'm giving you are non-controversial among scholars. In other words, you're not going to find a lot of scholars who disagree with any of this. This is kind of standard fare. Another interesting passage is the last 12 verses of Mark's Gospel. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus is arrested. He's put on trial before Pontius Pilate. He's condemned. He is crucified. He's dead. He's buried. He's put in the tomb. And on the third day, the women go to the tomb, and the stone's rolled away, and they see a man inside. And the man tells them that Jesus is no longer here. He's been raised. The women are told to go to the disciples and tell them to meet Jesus in Galilee, up in the north, because he's been raised from the dead. And then Mark says, but the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. That's where it ends. That's the end of the Gospel of Mark. How could that be the end? Doesn't Jesus appear to his disciples? Don't the women tell somebody? Don't they go to Galilee? Don't they see him? Well, when scribes were copying Mark, they came to this end, for they were afraid, and they said, could this gospel end like this? And they said, no, it can't end like this. And so they added 12 verses. And so in your Bibles today, you'll find 12 additional verses. Often they're put in double brackets to indicate the translators know full well these were not originally part of the Gospel of Mark. These 12 verses, Jesus tells his disciples to go make disciples of all the nations, that if they make disciples, they're to teach them his commandments, that his followers will be able to handle snakes, and if they drink any deadly poison, it won't harm them. And then Jesus ascends to heaven. These are the verses that are used by sects of the Appalachian snake handlers in my part of the world. And I suppose somebody on the way to the hospital should point out to one of them that, in fact, those weren't really in the Bible. They were added later. These are verses that are not in our oldest and best manuscripts. The writing style of these verses differs from the rest of Mark. These weren't originally there. I'll give you two more quick examples. A very interesting example occurs of change that I think is interesting and significant, occurs in the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark. This is a story, a familiar story in which a leper comes up to Jesus and asks Jesus to be healed. And we're told this leper comes up to Jesus and says, if you're willing, you're able to make me clean. And in many manuscripts it says, and Jesus, feeling compassion, reached out his hand and touched him and says, I am willing, be clean. And he was cleansed of his leprosy. It's striking that in a couple of our oldest manuscripts, we have a different phrasing of the account. In a couple of manuscripts, instead of saying, feeling compassion, he reached out his hand and touched him, it says, and getting angry, he reached out his hand and touched him and said, I'm willing, be cleansed. Getting angry? What would it mean that he got angry? Well, now the way you interpret the text is one question, but the question of what the text is a separate question. And one of the ways text critics decide what the text originally probably said is by asking themselves this question. If a scribe came across this passage and saw that it said Jesus felt compassion, would the scribe be inclined to change it to say he got angry? Alternatively, if a scribe came across this passage and saw that it said that Jesus got angry, might he be inclined to change it to say, well, he felt compassion? Well, yeah, put that way, the latter is the more likely possibility, which means that it's more likely that the text originally said that Jesus got angry. And so that then leaves open the door to discuss what, in fact, he was angry about. I give my students a little exercise with the Gospel of Mark. I tell them to read through Mark chapters 1 through 6. Just, pretend this is the first time you've seen any Gospel. You don't know anything about Jesus, and all you have is Mark, and in one sitting you read chapters 1 through 6, and indicate what kind of guy is Jesus. Who is he? What's he like? It turns out that he's not the good shepherd of the stained glass window in Mark. He gets angry several times. He's not somebody you want to mess with. He's powerful. He gets irritated. And this is one of the, whether or not you have this passage in, that's the portrayal in Mark. And it seems like this passage contributes to that overall portrayal. Well, why is he angry? That's a question interpreters have to ask once they know what the text says. I'll give you one final example. One of the most famous sayings of Jesus comes in the Gospel of Luke when Jesus is being nailed to the cross. This is found only in Luke. You don't get it in Matthew, Mark, or John. In Luke's Gospel, when Jesus is being nailed to the cross, Jesus cries out, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. In the early church, it was understood that Jesus was praying not for the Roman soldiers who were actually nailing him to the cross, but for the Jewish people who were responsible for him going to the cross in the first place. This was a prayer of forgiveness for the Jewish people in rejecting Jesus, according to early interpretations of the Christian church, which makes it all the more interesting what happens to this verse during the period when it's being interpreted that way. A number of scribes have omitted the verse, so that in some manuscripts, Jesus doesn't pray, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Well, why would scribes omit it? Because they omitted it in a time when anti-Judaism was on the rise, and Christians thought that God never did forgive the Jews. Christians started saying that, in fact, God had turned his back on the Jews, that God had destroyed Jerusalem in exchange for what the Jews had done to Jesus, that this is when Jews are starting to be called Christ killers. In fact, they're starting to be called killers of God. Jesus is God, Jews responsible for Jesus' death, therefore Jews are killers of God. Surely Jesus didn't pray for forgiveness. Well, what do you do with the fact that he does pray for forgiveness? You take it out of the text. This is another instance, then, of scribes changing the text to make it say either what they want it to say or to make it say what they think it probably already means. Well, there are hundreds of examples like this that we could talk all night about, but I'm going to wrap this up very quickly by summarizing what I think are the main points. We have thousands of manuscripts and hundreds of thousands of differences in these manuscripts. These differences, most of them are insignificant and immaterial and don't matter for anything, but some of them are really important. They matter for some fundamental things about the interpretation of the New Testament. Does the Gospel of Luke teach that Jesus' death brings an atonement for sin? Okay, well, that's a historical question, and it depends which of the textual differences you go with. Does Jesus get angry, or does he feel compassion for the leper? Depends which text you read. In the Gospel of John, is Jesus called the only God or not? Depends which manuscript you read. There are all sorts of differences through our manuscripts, and there are two tasks confronting scholars with this textual situation. The first and kind of obvious task is to try and figure out what the authors wrote. The logic being that you can't know what Mark meant if you don't know what he said. And so you have to have his words. And so that's one obvious task that scholars have been involved with quite fervently since John Mill published his edition of the Greek New Testament in 1707. But the second thing that scholars have gotten interested in is seeing why the text was changed in the first place. By seeing how the text was changed, you can say something about what was happening in the lives and thoughts of the scribes who are otherwise anonymous and completely unknown to us. So we can learn about how scribes were maybe opposed to Jews, or how scribes were opposed to women participating in church, or how scribes were in support of particular theological views and opposed to other theological views. This kind of study of these manuscripts then can help us better understand the history of the church and thereby understand the history of the Christianity that's come down to us today. Thank you very much.